It was August 1945, and the Pacific sky hung low over the island of Luzon, thick with heat and silence after years of thunder. The war was ending, though no one yet dared to say it aloud. In a makeshift clearing outside a ruined sugar mill near Santo Tomas, a group of Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and wives of officers, sat on the hard earth, waiting for the sound they had feared since childhood. It came not as a scream, but as a rhythm. American boots, dozens of them, moving in perfect cadence through the debris of empire. For these women, who had been raised on stories of the barbaric foreigner, this moment felt like the edge of the world. The air carried the metallic scent of rust and burned oil. Smoke rose from shattered trucks and collapsed barracks, their frames bent like ribs. Behind the women, a tattered flag clung to a pole, its red sun barely visible through the grime. One woman, her hands trembling over a torn khaki skirt, whispered a prayer to a god she was no longer sure was listening. The sound of English, sharp, unfamiliar, echoing down the corridor of jungle, made them shrink instinctively. They expected cruelty, vengeance, and humiliation. Instead, the first American soldier who stepped into the clearing stopped, lowered his rifle, and simply looked at them. He was young, barely 20, with dust coating his helmet and exhaustion pulling at his shoulders. He said nothing. The women studied him through strands of unwashed hair, eyes darting between the rifle and his face. They saw no hatred there, only fatigue, confusion, maybe pity. It was the first fracture in years of propaganda. The enemy they had imagined as monstrous looked human. That alone was terrifying. For weeks, rumors had reached their compound through scraps of captured radio. Stories of American atrocities, of women violated, of villages burned. Yet those tales came from voices they could not see. Now the war had collapsed, and the victors stood before them, not as shadows but as flesh. One soldier reached into his pack, pulled out a canteen, and placed it on the ground between them. The woman flinched. He backed away. The eldest, once a nurse in Manila's military hospital, crawled forward and lifted the canteen with both hands. The water inside tasted. The Americans' technology fascinated them. When a corporal demonstrated a field transmitter, its wires gleaming under the sun, one of the former nurses gasped. She had worked in a Japanese communications unit, where such devices were scarce and temperamental. The American version was compact, durable, and tuned to frequencies she had never seen. It could relay coordinates in seconds, guiding artillery fire or medical support with frightening accuracy. In that moment, she realized the terrifying efficiency behind the seemingly casual calm of their captors. It wasn't luck that had brought them victory. It was engineering. Behind the lines, the logistical machine of the United States stretched across the Pacific like a steel artery. Ships unloaded food, medicine, and mail at a scale unimaginable to the Japanese home front. Refrigerated containers kept meat fresh for months, and portable desalination units turned seawater into drinking water. The women, once trained to ration rice and sew uniforms from curtains, stared in disbelief as soldiers unpacked boxes of powdered milk, coffee, and canned fruit. The abundance felt surreal, almost cruel. How could a nation that fed its army like this ever have been defeated? The question haunted them as much as the memories of their lost homeland. One of the women, young, barely 20, had been engaged to a pilot in the Imperial Navy. He had died in the skies over Leyte, convinced that courage alone could balance the scales against superior machines. When she saw American mechanics rebuilding an aircraft engine under a canvas tent, her breath caught. Their movements were clean and methodical. They replaced valves and cylinders with precision instruments, their wrenches glinting like surgical tools. To her, it looked less like repair and more like resurrection. She realized the Americans treated machines as living extensions of strategy, not disposable instruments of sacrifice. Everywhere they looked, the women saw evidence of discipline fused with compassion. The American field hospitals shocked them most. Rows of white tents, generators humming, sterilizers boiling water, efficiency married to humanity. The nurses there tended not only to Allied soldiers, but to Japanese prisoners as well. The captured women were initially reluctant to step inside, fearing interrogation or humiliation. Instead, they found kindness so foreign it felt almost suspicious. A medic handed out penicillin tablets as casually as if they were sweets. One of the Japanese nurses whispered that she had lost dozens of men because her own hospital never had enough. The realization stung more than defeat. It was the knowledge that science and logistics, not ideology, had decided the war's outcome. The women soon learned of the vast American supply depots near Manila's outskirts. Crates of ammunition and food stretched for miles under tarpaulins. Bulldozers cleared rubble with engines that growled like beasts, their drivers sweating under the tropical sun. It wasn't just victory through force, it was victory through planning. Each crate carried a number, each convoy a destination. Compared to the chaos of the Japanese retreat, it seemed divine in its order. One of the prisoners murmured that Japan had built warriors. America had built a system. Then came the day of the demonstration. To assure cooperation and prevent rumors, an American captain invited the Japanese women to observe a post-surrender training exercise on the edge of the city. They stood behind a rope line as infantry units practiced coordinated maneuvers with tanks and radio-linked artillery. The air shook with controlled violence. The tanks moved like predators, stopping, pivoting, and firing in unison as the radios crackled commands. The synchronization was terrifyingly beautiful, each gunner responding to unseen voices, each blast part of an invisible choreography. For the women, it was revelation through terror. The empire they had served had worshipped courage. The empire that conquered them worshipped coordination. That night, they whispered among themselves in the barracks. Some called it dishonorable, that machines had replaced spirit. Others, quietly, said it was simply the future. The difference was not moral but mechanical. A generation of Japanese children had been taught to die for the emperor. American soldiers had been taught to communicate, repair, and adapt. And in that contrast lay the real defeat. One of the women, who had once been a schoolteacher, began to record what she saw. She wrote about the radios, the maps, the clean uniforms, and the endless supplies of food. Her words were not bitter. They were curious, analytical, and almost admiring. She noted that American soldiers laughed easily, even with prisoners, that they rarely shouted, that their discipline came not from fear, but from routine. She described a civilization that had learned to harness war without losing its humanity. Her diary, later recovered by historians, became one of the earliest personal accounts from a Japanese female prisoner of the Pacific campaigns. Days later, the women were transported again, this time to a larger camp under joint medical supervision. Here, American and Filipino engineers were rebuilding the perimeter using prefabricated steel panels. The efficiency of it was astonishing. The women watched as the entire fence rose in hours, held by bolts instead of welding. They realized the Americans didn't just fight wars. They industrialized them. Every piece of metal, every crate, and every schedule was part of a grand equation. The camp also held male prisoners, many of them gaunt and broken. The women avoided them at first, ashamed of their survival. But as days passed, they began to speak through the fence. The men told them of sea battles lost to radar and of aircraft that appeared from clouds and vanished before gunfire could reach. They spoke of night raids guided by signals they could never trace and of ships that found them in the dark by echo alone. The women listened, understanding that their captor's true weapon had not been firepower, but information. By the time September came, the Japanese women no longer looked at American soldiers with fear. They saw them as proof of something larger, the triumph of method over myth. These men, with their radios, cranes, and ration tins, had rewritten the meaning of war itself. And as the women were moved again toward repatriation ships waiting in the harbor, they felt the strange certainty that they were witnessing not just the end of one empire, but the birth of another. None of them could have known that what they had seen, the quiet efficiency, the technological dominance, the moral restraint, would soon become the foundation of a new world order. But in their silence, as the ships pulled away from the Philippine shore, they understood one thing. The shock of meeting their enemies face to face had not just changed how they saw Americans. It had changed how they saw humanity. The voyage home took nearly 3 weeks. The ship, once a U.S. cargo vessel, now carried repatriated prisoners, Japanese soldiers, nurses, and civilians who had once served the empire with blind devotion. The women spent their days on deck, staring at the endless horizon, wondering what waited beyond it. The ocean smelled of oil and salt, and the hum of engines became their only constant. Every night, they watched the American crew perform their duties with quiet discipline, cleaning, logging, and maintaining the ship's systems. It was a rhythm that seemed immune to exhaustion. The women realized that this calm, mechanical order was the same force that had reshaped the Pacific. It wasn't brutality that had conquered them. It was endurance, the unshakable efficiency of men who never lost their sense of routine. When they reached Japan, the shock was worse than any they had known in captivity. Cities lay flattened into gray deserts. Tokyo, Nagoya, Hiroshima, all burned into silence. For those who had imagined heroic defeat, the sight of their homeland crushed beneath American bombers shattered the illusion completely. Yet, amid the ruins, the women also saw something else. American trucks, American engineers, and American uniforms. Not with rifles this time, but with tools. The same men who had once dropped fire from the sky were now unloading crates of medicine and grain. The reversal was too much to comprehend. The conquerors had returned as caretakers to in the refugee processing centers. The women gave statements to occupation officers. They spoke of their experiences, their surprise at the treatment they had received, and their disbelief at the discipline and humanity of their captors. Some officials dismissed their stories as sentimental. Others quietly recorded every word, understanding their potential to bridge two nations divided by hatred. Newspapers began printing cautious stories about kind Americans and humane captors. For a country taught that surrender was shame, these accounts were revolutionary. They planted the first seeds of psychological reconstruction, the slow replacement of fear with respect.
In the months that followed, the women were integrated into Japan's massive social rebuilding efforts. Many volunteered as translators, nurses, or clerks for American humanitarian missions. They found themselves working alongside the same kind of men who had once guarded them: engineers, medics, and logisticians. The women learned how to type on American machines, to operate radio transmitters, and to manage inventory with methods they had never seen before. They were no longer prisoners. They were witnesses to the transformation of their country from a military empire into an industrial democracy. The irony was inescapable. Their captors had not only defeated their army, they were now teaching them how to rebuild it differently. The psychological impact ran deeper than politics. The women had carried guilt and shame, convinced that surviving captivity was dishonorable. But as they saw American soldiers treating civilians with dignity, they began to reinterpret survival as strength. One former POW wrote that the Americans' restraint had crushed Japan's spirit more than any bomb. Yet she didn't mean it in bitterness. She meant it as an awakening. To see the enemy show mercy was to witness a power beyond war, a moral victory that could not be measured in weapons or casualties. American officials noticed this change. Reports from occupation psychologists described how Japanese civilians, particularly women, responded more positively to American behavior than to propaganda. The mere act of kindness, sharing rations, offering medical care, respecting customs, was reprogramming an entire population. It was a victory of perception. While American engineers rebuilt bridges and factories, American behavior rebuilt trust. The women, once symbols of Japan's purity and endurance, became messengers of this strange new truth, that defeat could become the foundation of rebirth. For the Americans, too, the encounter left a mark. Soldiers who had spent years fighting a faceless enemy now saw that enemy's humanity. Many wrote home about it. Letters spoke of Japanese women who thanked them, who cried when given food, and who reminded them of sisters back in Iowa or Kansas. In a war that had dehumanized both sides, these moments restored something vital. The soldiers began to realize that mercy was not weakness, it was the final act of victory. Their restraint in those days became part of the moral narrative America carried into the post-war world, shaping its image not just as a conqueror, but as a liberator. As Reconstruction accelerated, Japan became a vast workshop for American ideals. Engineers from Detroit and Chicago advised on factory rebuilding. Radio networks sprang up, powered by technology that once guided bombers. Schools taught English phrases and democratic values. The women who had seen the Americans up close recognized familiar patterns, the same order, discipline, and confidence they had first observed in Manila. But now, it was being transferred into Japanese hands. It was as if the occupation itself was a great relay, passing not just tools but philosophies. The efficiency of the conqueror was becoming the language of the conquered. The legacy of that transformation reached far beyond the war's end. Many of the women married, worked, and raised families in the new Japan, their children growing up amid prosperity and peace. Some wrote memoirs decades later, recalling the moment they first saw American soldiers. The memory had never faded, the silence, the fear, and then the realization that compassion could emerge from uniforms once painted as monstrous. To them, that meeting had been the real turning point, not the surrender ceremony aboard the Missouri, but the instant when humanity overpowered hatred. Historians later noted that this kind of encounter played a hidden role in stabilizing post-war Japan. While policy and economics shaped headlines, it was these personal moments, the offered canteen, the shared chocolate, the respectful silence, that softened the edges of occupation. Empires fall by force, but peace is built by perception. And perception changed because of what these women saw, not an army of vengeance, but an army of systems, mercy, and relentless practicality. Years later, during the Cold War, Japanese leaders often cited the early occupation as proof that power and restraint could coexist. The same logistical discipline that had stunned the women in captivity became the backbone of Japan's industrial miracle. The very qualities that had defeated them, organization, innovation, and precision, became their salvation. The irony was complete, yet profound. The enemy's strengths had become the nation's own virtues. In interviews decades later, one of the surviving women said softly, "We learn not from bombs, but from behavior." By the late 20th century, the narrative of cruelty that once dominated wartime propaganda had been replaced by something unexpected: admiration. Japan and the United States became allies, trading partners, and cultural mirrors. The women who had lived through the transition watched with quiet awe as American movies, music, and machines flooded the country that once swore to destroy them. They saw schoolchildren learning English, factories built to American blueprints, and young engineers citing Ford and Edison as inspirations. What began as surrender had become synchronization. In their final years, many of those women wrote reflections for oral history projects. Their voices trembled with age but carried clarity untouched by time. They spoke not of ideology, but of humanity. The day they looked into the eyes of their supposed enemies and saw decency. They said that was when they understood the real meaning of power. Not domination, not fear, but control, of self, of emotion, of what comes after victory. It was that self-control, they said, that truly ended the war. The shock of that first face-to-face meeting never faded. It lived in memory as both wound and lesson. For them, it proved that even in the wreckage of total war, the capacity for empathy could survive. And for the world that followed, it became a quiet example of how the strongest nations are not those that conquer the fastest, but those that choose what kind of conqueror they will be.